Normandy, July 1944. Dawn mist drifts over the hedgerows as a column of German Tiger I tanks crawls along a dirt road near St. Lo. Their steel tracks grind through the earth, echoing like thunder across the valley. The crews, young, proud, and hardened by years on the Eastern Front, sit tall inside their machines. To them, the Tiger is not just a tank. It is invincibility forged in steel. Inside one turret, the loader smirks. He's seen Shermans burn before they even reach firing range. The commander peers through his cupola, scanning the calm countryside. The Luftwaffe is gone, but no matter. The Tiger's 88mm gun, he believes, can face anything. Above the rising haze, the faint hum of engines begins to build. At first, it's mistaken for distant artillery. Then it grows louder, deeper, until the sky trembles. A formation of American P-47 Thunderbolts descends from the morning light. Sunlight flashes on their wings as they dive, bombs armed, guns ready. In seconds, pride turns to panic. The battlefield below is about to change forever. In the early years of World War II, German armor was the spearhead of blitzkrieg, a new kind of warfare that rewrote every rule. Speed, coordination, and shock were its essence. Yet as 1941 unfolded on the vast plains of the Soviet Union, German commanders began to face a new reality: the Red Army's T-34. The T-34 was faster, sloped, and resilient, something the Panzer III and IV could barely dent. Reports from the Eastern Front poured into Berlin. Entire panzer battalions found their shells bouncing off Russian armor. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's mechanized pride was shaken. In response, Hitler demanded a tank that could dominate all others. The order went out to Henschel and Porsche, two engineering giants competing to deliver the most powerful armored weapon in existence. From this race emerged the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger, a machine so formidable that its very name carried psychological weight. When it first appeared in late 1942 near Leningrad, Allied intelligence dismissed it as exaggerated propaganda. But then came the battlefield reports. British and Soviet crews spoke of tanks destroyed from over a mile away, precision shots that cut through armor like paper. The Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 gun, adapted from the Luftwaffe's famed anti-aircraft weapon, gave it a reach no other tank could match. To German crews, it felt like invincibility reborn. The thick armor, over 100 millimeters at the front, made it impervious to most Allied weapons. Its immense weight, more than 50 tons, slowed it to a crawl. But to its operators, that didn't matter. The Tiger wasn't built to chase. It was built to destroy. By 1943, as the battles of Kharkov and Kursk raged, the Tiger became legend. Entire Soviet tank units were reported to retreat at the mere sight of its silhouette. German propaganda films showed Tigers rolling through villages, shells glancing off their armor, their crews confident and calm inside. But beneath that aura of power was a hidden fragility. The Tiger's complexity made it a maintenance nightmare. Its transmission was prone to failure, and spare parts were scarce. Many Tigers were abandoned not in combat, but because they broke down in mud or snow. Still, these truths were rarely spoken among the crews. To them, the Tiger was the embodiment of German engineering, the mechanical symbol of a war they still believed could be won. The psychological effect was just as profound as its firepower. Infantry followed behind with renewed courage, believing that nothing could stop them as long as a Tiger led the way. Even Allied soldiers, upon encountering wrecked Tigers, often described them in awe: monsters, steel beasts, invincible fortresses. For Hitler, the Tiger became more than a weapon. It was a statement of German superiority. Factories were ordered to prioritize its production despite limited resources. Skilled engineers, technicians, and materials were funneled into the program, even as other parts of the war effort began to strain. The Tiger's crews, often hand-picked, veterans were regarded as elite within the Wehrmacht. They trained meticulously, learning to exploit the gun's precision and the armor's endurance. In their minds, they were knights of a new mechanical order, warriors encased in steel, carrying the Reich's pride into battle. But as 1943 gave way to 1944, the war itself was changing faster than the Tiger could adapt. The skies were no longer German. Allied aircraft grew in number, range, and coordination. What began as a ground war was becoming a three-dimensional battlefield, where no tank, however mighty, could survive without air cover. And yet, inside those steel hulls, the crews held to their faith. To them, the Tiger was still king. They didn't yet know that soon the sound of engines overhead, not tank tracks, would decide who lived or died on the battlefield. By late 1943, the tides of war had begun to turn. The German Tiger reigned, supreme on the ground, but above it a new force was gathering momentum. The Allied air campaign, once disorganized and costly, was evolving into a precise instrument of destruction. At the heart of that transformation was a single realization. To defeat the Tiger, one didn't need another tank. One needed control of the skies. When the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, entered the European theater in strength, its early missions were focused on strategic bombing, striking factories, railways, and oil refineries deep inside occupied Europe. But as the war pushed closer to Germany, the battlefield needs changed. Commanders required aircraft that could not only escort bombers but also support the troops below, fast, rugged, and lethal to ground targets. From this need came two icons, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. The P-47 was a beast of an aircraft, large, heavily armored, and armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because that's exactly what it was. It could dive fast, take punishment, and still return home riddled with holes. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin boom design, was equally formidable. Fast at low altitudes, stable in attack dives, and capable of long-range missions that reached deep behind enemy lines. By mid-1944, these planes were no longer just escorts. They were tank killers. American engineers and tacticians worked relentlessly to turn these fighters into precision strike platforms. Rockets, bombs, and armor-piercing rounds were developed specifically to target armored columns. Pilots trained to identify the weak spots of German tanks, the top armor, the engine deck, the thin rear plating. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, every detail was refined. Ground units coordinated with air controllers. Radio frequencies were synchronized. The new doctrine of fighter-bomber support was born, where the moment a German column was spotted, air units could be called in within minutes. For the German tank crews, this development was a silent threat. In training manuals, they had studied how to defeat other tanks, where to aim, when to flank, how to coordinate with infantry. But there was no manual for fighting the sky. By the time the Allied landings in Normandy began on June 6, 1944, the balance of power had shifted entirely. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its fuel reserves crippled, its pilots exhausted, its aircraft outnumbered 10 to 1. German tanks, once proud and self-assured, now rolled into battle without a single plane to cover them. It was in this new reality that American pilots began their deadly work. Flying low, often below the treetops, they hunted the roads and hedgerows of France, searching for movement. The once invincible Tigers became targets, massive, slow silhouettes, visible even from a mile away. The Thunderbolts would dive, unleashing machine gun bursts and high-explosive rockets that tore through the thin top armor. The P-38s would strafe convoys, their 20mm cannons punching holes into engines and fuel tanks. Even when not destroyed, the Tigers were immobilized, tracks shattered, optics damaged, crews forced to abandon them under fire. German reports from Normandy are filled with accounts of tank units being decimated before they could even reach the front lines. One officer wrote bitterly, "It is no longer a battle between tanks. It is a battle between tanks and the sky." Every passing week, the skies grew darker for the Wehrmacht. Allied pilots dominated the daylight, and with every strike, German morale withered. The Tiger's thick armor no longer felt invincible. It felt like a trap. The stage was set for the inevitable confrontation, the pride of German armor against the relentless precision of American air power. And that confrontation would come soon, on the broken fields of Normandy and beyond, where the legend of the tiger would begin to crumble beneath the roar of engines from above. Inside a tiger tank, the world was small: metal walls, oil fumes, the constant vibration of machinery. 5 men worked as one: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. They lived and fought in a space barely large enough to stretch their legs, surrounded by ammunition and the smell of diesel. Yet, for those inside, it felt like a throne. Veterans from the Eastern Front carried stories of glory, of knocking out dozens of Soviet T-34s, of entire battles decided by a single tiger. To them, the tiger wasn't just a weapon, it was a status symbol, a mark of superiority. Crews were handpicked, their morale high, their training meticulous. They trusted the machine as they trusted their comrades. But that pride carried a shadow. Each tiger was a resource-intensive marvel, slow to build, hard to repair, and often stranded by its own weight. Still, among those who fought inside, the belief remained unshaken. No enemy tank could defeat them head-on. That belief would soon be tested by something they could neither see nor reach. The tiger's reputation was built on 2 pillars: fear and precision. Its 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman or Cromwell at ranges beyond a kilometer. The armor, nearly impenetrable from the front, was a masterpiece of metallurgy. Even its optics, crafted by Zeiss, were unmatched. But the tiger's brilliance came at a cost. It was a weapon of perfection in an imperfect war. Its size and weight limited mobility. Bridges collapsed under it and mud could trap it for days. Every kilometer driven wore down its complex suspension. Fuel consumption was enormous, over 500 liters per 100 kilometers. In ideal conditions, the tiger was a fortress. But the war was no longer fought in ideal conditions. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting on multiple fronts with dwindling fuel and overworked supply chains. Many tigers arrived at the battlefield with mechanical faults already developing. Allied reconnaissance soon recognized these weaknesses. Reports noted that tigers often traveled on predictable routes, roads and open terrain where their weight could be supported. That predictability would make them perfect prey for aircraft. The engineering masterpiece that once symbolized invincibility had become a target too large to hide. For the American fighter-bomber pilots flying the P-47s and P-38s, the war looked entirely different. From a few thousand feet above, they saw movement, flashes, and shadows. Their missions demanded not courage alone, but instinct: to spot targets, dive at breakneck speeds, and release ordnance within seconds. A tiger tank from the air looked like a dark rectangular wound against the earth, impossible to miss. Pilots like Robert S. Johnson and Francis Gabreski, both Thunderbolt aces, described the thrill and terror of low-level attack runs. The P-47 could dive steeply, unleash rockets or bombs, and climb back into the sky, shrugging off flak that shredded lighter aircraft. Each mission carried risk. German anti-aircraft guns were everywhere. But with every sortie, they learned how to strike fuel convoys, ammunition trucks, and finally the armored columns themselves. To these pilots, the tiger was not a symbol of fear, but of opportunity. It represented the concentrated power of the enemy, and destroying it meant crippling German morale. After a successful run, pilots often saw only black smoke and small dots scattering from the wreckage, tank crews fleeing from burning armor. From that height, war seemed both distant and intimate, mechanical and human all at once. Before Normandy, airstrikes and ground movements often operated independently. Communication was slow, coordination uncertain. But by mid-1944, Allied command had perfected a revolutionary concept: close air support. Forward air controllers embedded with ground troops could now radio in real-time coordinates. Pilots circling above were on standby, ready to respond within minutes. A single radio call could summon a squadron of Thunderbolts or Lightnings to strike a road, bridge, or armored column. This synergy turned the battlefield into a fluid system of eyes, guns, and wings. German tanks could no longer maneuver freely by day. Even static positions became death traps once spotted from above. In effect, the Allies had achieved something the Germans never fully mastered: the integration of air and land warfare into one living organism. What began as tactical innovation soon became psychological dominance. German tank crews learned to dread the distant hum of engines long before the first rocket fell. And that fear, invisible, creeping, relentless, was beginning to erode the very confidence that once defined them. By the summer of 1944, German armored troops had begun to experience a new kind of terror, one that no armor thickness could stop. At first it came as a faint vibration, the low hum of radial engines somewhere beyond the clouds. Then the sound grew, a chorus of engines approaching fast. Crews scrambled inside their Tigers, scanning the horizon through periscopes and slit visors, trying to locate what they couldn't yet see. Seconds later, the world erupted. Bombs, rockets, and strafing fire shredded everything that moved. The sky itself felt weaponized. Many Tiger veterans later described the helplessness of those moments. They were trained to duel, to calculate range, to outmaneuver tanks, not to fight an enemy they could never shoot back at. The 80mm gun that once commanded the battlefield was useless against the clouds. Even when not directly attacked, the psychological weight of constant air threat changed behavior. Tank units began moving only at night or under cover of forest. During the day, they camouflaged with branches, hiding in barns or tree lines. Maintenance crews worked in silence, glancing upward after every distant drone of sound. This fear eroded confidence, and confidence had always been the Tiger's invisible armor. Reports from Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, one of Germany's elite heavy tank battalions, described the growing paralysis. Convoys delayed movements, supply lines slowed, commanders hesitated to advance. Even elite crews began to question whether their machines could survive another day of open-road exposure. One officer wrote in his logbook after an Allied air raid near Mortagne, "Our tanks are no longer weapons. They are targets. Every open field is a death sentence." It was a stark reversal of the early war years, when Tigers struck fear into entire divisions. Now it was the Tiger crews themselves who felt hunted. The transformation was not just tactical, it was psychological. The once proud knights of German armor were losing faith not in themselves, but in the very concept of invincibility. And in war, when belief dies before the body does, defeat becomes only a matter of time. For the Allied pilots, the destruction of German armor was both necessary and sobering. Each mission meant saving lives on the ground. American, British, Canadian soldiers pinned down by tanks and artillery. But with each strike came the sight of burning convoys, shattered crews, and men fleeing from machines that had once symbolized domination. Some pilots later spoke of the strange duality of air power, the exhilaration of victory and the haunting awareness of what lay below. Unlike tank crews who fought within shouting distance of the enemy, pilots waged war from altitude, detached, surgical, and often unseen. Strategically, air dominance had become the ultimate equalizer. The Allies no longer needed heavier tanks or thicker armor. They needed control of the sky. The P-47 and P-38 proved that mobility, coordination, and precision could outweigh brute strength and engineering complexity. For German high command, this shift carried devastating consequences. Every Tiger destroyed from the air represented not just a lost tank, but a lost investment. Months of production, tons of steel, hundreds of skilled labor hours. Factories in Kassel and Henschel could never replace them fast enough. More importantly, the psychological war was over. The Tiger, once a symbol of German technological supremacy, had been dethroned by an invisible hand, not by a better tank, but by a new philosophy of war. This realization echoed beyond 1944. Commanders across the world understood what had happened in Normandy, that air superiority was no longer support, it was the decisive weapon. The battlefield had permanently changed dimensions, yet in the quiet after battle, even among the victors, there remained unease. What did it mean when power could descend from the sky without warning? When steel giants could be erased in seconds? Technology had won the battle, but it had also made war colder, faster, more distant from the human soul. As 1944 moved toward its climax, both sides understood this truth in their own way. For the Germans, it meant despair. For the Americans, it meant inevitability. And soon, on the fields of Normandy and the roads of France, that inevitability would unfold in fire and dust. The moment when air power crushed the myth of the Tiger once and for all. July 25, 1944, Normandy, France. The air trembled long before the ground did. At 9:30 in the morning, thousands of Allied aircraft filled the sky over the western edge of the Normandy front. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the American offensive designed to finally break through the dense German defensive lines near St. Lo. For days, rain and low clouds had grounded aircraft. Now the weather cleared and the signal was given. What followed was one of the most concentrated air bombardments in history. From horizon to horizon, the sky turned silver. The gleam of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators moving in formation, their engines roaring like an unbroken storm. Below, German troops and armor of Panzer Lehr Division, 2nd SS Panzer, and scattered heavy tank detachments waited behind hedgerows and fields. Among them, several Tiger I tanks. The German crews watched the sky in disbelief. Many had fought on the Eastern Front but had never seen anything like this. One soldier later recalled, the entire sky was covered with planes. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. At 9:40, the first wave began. Bombs cascaded in sheets, high explosives tearing open the earth, smoke rising in black columns that blotted out the sun. The Tigers, each weighing over 50 tons, shook violently as the ground convulsed beneath them. Crew members clutched their helmets, their instruments rattling inside the steel hulls. Then came the fighter bombers. Dozens of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings dove through the smoke, attacking anything that moved. Their machine guns stitched the roads with fire and rockets screamed into the tree lines. To the pilots above, the targets below looked like an anthill being torn apart. One German Tiger crew tried to move, their commander ordering a withdrawal to the next defensive ridge. But as soon as they emerged from the hedgerow, the sky found them. A Thunderbolt dived low, releasing a 500-pound bomb that struck meters away. The explosion flipped the 57-ton tank onto its side like a toy. All across the sector, similar scenes unfolded. Columns were obliterated before they could even form. Radio communication broke down entirely. Smoke, dust, and debris filled the air. In less than an hour, entire German formations ceased to exist. When the bombing finally subsided, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Craters stretching for miles, trees uprooted, tanks reduced to twisted wrecks. Survivors stumbled through what one officer called a landscape from another planet. Among them were a handful of Tiger crews, dazed but alive, their armor scorched and engines silent. They had survived the bombardment, but the battle was far from over. The next phase of Operation Cobra unleashed the ground assault. American infantry and Sherman tanks advanced cautiously behind the smoke, supported by artillery and air patrols still circling above. For the Germans, there was no time to regroup. Every attempt to mount a counterattack was met with instant retaliation from the sky. The Luftwaffe was absent. Outnumbered, undersupplied, and fuel-starved, its few remaining aircraft stayed grounded hundreds of miles away. For the first time in the war, the German army was fighting completely blind beneath an enemy-controlled sky. By afternoon, the Panzer Lehr Division, once considered one of the Wehrmacht's elite, was effectively destroyed. Of its 200 armored vehicles, more than half were lost to airstrikes and artillery before ever engaging the Americans. Even the surviving Tigers found themselves stranded, their supply trucks annihilated. Without fuel or ammunition, their thick armor was useless. Many crews scuttled their own machines, detonating charges inside before retreating on foot. The myth of the Tiger, its aura of invincibility, hung shattered that day. What had begun as an armored duel had become a one-sided storm. The German tank, for all its engineering brilliance, was now a relic of a vanishing age, a weapon of two dimensions in a war that had entered the third. And as Operation Cobra ripped open the German lines, the road to Paris, and eventually the Rhine, lay open. But the destruction on July 25th was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Tiger's downfall would continue, from St. Lo to Falaise, as American and British air power hunted the remnants of Hitler's proudest divisions across the roads of France. In the days following Operation Cobra, the German front in Normandy began to unravel. What had once been an organized line of defense was now a mosaic of broken units, shattered vehicles, and abandoned roads littered with wreckage. The roar of the Tiger's 88mm gun, once the sound of dominance, was replaced by the ceaseless drone of Allied aircraft. By early August 1944, German High Command ordered a desperate counteroffensive near Mortagne, hoping to drive the Americans back toward Avranches and cut off their advance. Among the attacking units were remnants of elite formations: Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, 2nd SS Panzer Das Reich, and 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte. Their mission was to strike fast, pierce the American lines, and restore the front. But the plan ignored one brutal reality. The sky no longer belonged to them. At dawn on August 7th, the German tanks moved out. Among them, more than 30 Tigers rolled slowly through the mist-covered Norman fields. Inside their turrets, crews steadied their nerves, clutching faith in the armor that had once made them legends. Above them, at forward airfields across England and France, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts were already warming engines. Allied spotter planes had intercepted radio chatter and pinpointed the movement. Within hours, the counterattack would be under the full gaze of American air power. When the first Thunderbolts arrived, the German columns were still several kilometers from their objectives. The attack came without warning, dive after dive. The fighter bombers rained down high-explosive rockets and bombs, their trails cutting white scars through the morning haze. Crews abandoned vehicles mid-road, running for ditches or tree lines. The Tiger's thick top armor, never designed for plunging fire, buckled under direct hits. Even near misses could lift 50 tons of steel from the ground. Major Friedrich August von der Heide, observing the scene, later wrote, "The road was a single column of fire. Tanks, trucks, and men burned together. The air itself seemed to explode." Within a single day, the German counterattack collapsed. Out of more than 200 tanks committed, fewer than 40 remained operational. The Tiger crews who survived called it Der Himmelschlag, the blow from heaven. And the destruction did not end there. As the German retreat accelerated, the Allies encircled the remnants of their forces between Falaise, Argentan, and Troon, the infamous Falaise Pocket. Trapped inside were nearly 100,000 German soldiers and hundreds of vehicles, including dozens of Tigers from the once proud heavy battalions. For days, the pocket became a slaughterhouse. Every attempt to break out was met by artillery from the ground and relentless strafing from above. Allied pilots described the roads as black rivers of smoke and twisted metal. Tanks clogged every route, many still intact but abandoned, their crews fled or dead from near misses. Reconnaissance photographs taken after the battle revealed the scale. Tigers lying nose down in craters, columns of armor destroyed by single bombs, entire battalions erased in open fields. Among them was Tiger 332, belonging to Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101, famously commanded by Michael Wittmann, Germany's most celebrated tank ace. On August 8, 1944, near Saint-Aignan-de-Craminil, Wittmann's Tiger was ambushed and destroyed, most likely by British Shermans of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry or Canadian Typhoon aircraft circling above. The explosion blew the turret clear off, killing the entire crew. For the German army, Wittmann's death symbolized more than the loss of a hero. It marked the death of the Tiger's myth itself. By mid-August, the Falaise Pocket had closed. What escaped was only a fraction of the once formidable armored force. Hundreds of vehicles lay abandoned, victims not of tank battles but of rockets and bombs. American intelligence officers touring the battlefield described a landscape of ruin. Tigers burned out beside half-tracks, horses still harnessed to destroyed wagons, the stench of fuel and death hanging in the summer heat. The numbers told the story with finality. Between July 25 and August 20, 1944, the German army lost over 1,500 tanks and assault guns in Normandy, more than 60% to air attack or indirect destruction caused by it. From that point on, German armored divisions would never again recover their strength in the West. Every new tank produced faced the same inevitable truth. Without control of the skies, no armor could survive for long. The Tiger, once a symbol of dominance, had become a monument to a fading idea. That war could still be won by sheer firepower on the ground. Its fate at Falaise was not just a tactical defeat. It was the moment when the world saw the future of warfare written in smoke across the Norman sky. In the wake of Normandy, the roads of France told a silent story. Burnt-out Tigers lay rusting in hedgerows, their once polished armor blistered and split. Inside their open hatches, the smell of scorched metal and fuel lingered for weeks. The Luftwaffe, once the guardian of the Reich's armies, had all but vanished from the western skies. For the German tank crews who survived, the sense of loss was deeper than defeat. The Tiger had been their shield, their pride, a machine that turned ordinary soldiers into legends. But in the fields of Normandy, that legend had been shattered from above. Reports from Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 reveal the grim statistics. Of the 45 Tigers the battalion entered battle with in June, only 6 remained operational by late August. Similar stories came from Abteilung 101 and Abteilung 102, where crews were forced to abandon their vehicles simply because fuel or spare parts could no longer reach them. Supply lines were torn apart not by artillery, but by fighter bombers and reconnaissance aircraft that stalked every movement from dawn to dusk. German diaries recovered from the retreat describe the same haunting rhythm. Move at night, hide by day, pray for cloud cover. The sun, one Tiger gunner wrote, is no longer our ally. It calls death from the sky. Across the Western Front, the Tigers' battlefield dominance had been broken not by superior tanks but by superior coordination. American and British air commands had perfected a lethal partnership with their ground forces. Every German movement was tracked, reported, and intercepted within hours. What had once been a contest of armor became a contest of time and visibility, and in both, the Allies had absolute control. The transformation was total. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Typhoon, and later the P-51 Mustang were not just aircraft. They were instruments of a new kind of warfare. Pilots flew multiple missions a day, sweeping roads, rail lines, and bridges. Even tanks hidden under camouflage nets were hunted down by the faint glimmer of sunlight on steel. To German commanders, it was psychological torture. General Heinrich Eberbach, who led Panzer Group West, later recalled, "We could no longer move in daylight. Our tanks were no longer weapons, they were targets." The Allies, meanwhile, drew powerful lessons from the campaign. Normandy proved that air-ground integration was no longer an experiment. It was the foundation of modern warfare. Pilots learned to coordinate directly with advancing units using field radios and colored smoke markers. Within weeks, armored spearheads could call in strikes with pinpoint precision. What had taken the Germans years to perfect with blitzkrieg tactics was now being rewritten. This time not by tanks, but by aircraft. In the ruins of northern France, German engineers tried desperately to adapt. They reinforced tank roofs, added improvised armor plates, and even experimented with anti-aircraft versions of the Tiger chassis. But it was too late. The Reich no longer had the fuel, the steel, or the skies. As Allied forces broke through to Paris in late August 1944, the once-invincible Tiger had become a symbol of futility, a relic of a war that had moved beyond it. The proud crews who had once called themselves the Iron Fist of the Wehrmacht were now fighting a different kind of battle, one for survival. And even as they fell back toward the borders of Germany, they knew the War of the Machines had entered its final, merciless phase. The tank aces era was ending. The pilot's age had begun. By September 1944, the Tiger's shadow had vanished from the fields of France. What remained was wreckage, hulks of burned armor scattered from Normandy to the Seine. German forces retreated eastward, broken and disorganized, leaving behind not only their tanks but their entire doctrine of armored warfare. The panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been built on the belief that speed, firepower, and surprise could conquer any enemy. It had worked in Poland, in France, and for a time in Russia. But in the skies above Europe, that doctrine had met its natural enemy. Allied air power had turned the battlefield into a transparent chessboard. Every movement was visible, every supply column exposed. Tanks could no longer hide behind trees or hedgerows when reconnaissance aircraft hovered overhead, cameras clicking, radios relaying coordinates to strike wings minutes later. For German strategists, this collapse was more than a loss of equipment. It was a philosophical defeat. The Tiger, the ultimate expression of armored invincibility, had proven helpless without control of the air. The statistics from Normandy were devastating. Between June and August 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 900 aircraft, many destroyed on the ground. In that same period, German ground forces lost over 2,500 tanks and assault guns, half of them victims of aerial attack or the logistical paralysis caused by it. Even when tanks survived, they ran out of fuel long before they could fight. Allied dominance from the air also changed the rhythm of war for the soldiers below. German troops began to speak of Jabos, fighter bombers, with the same fear they once reserved for enemy artillery. Every rumble in the distance sent men diving for cover. Every glint in the sky halted convoys in their tracks. In contrast, American and British soldiers advanced with a new sense of confidence. They knew the sky was theirs. When pinned by enemy armor or strong points, they could call in air support within minutes. The battlefield had become an orchestra. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft all playing in lethal synchronization. It was this coordination, not just numbers, that broke the Wehrmacht's back. For Germany, the consequences reached deep into its military doctrine. Gone was the faith in singular machines, in the idea that a perfect tank could decide a war. The Tiger had been magnificent, yes, but also monstrously heavy, slow to produce, and nearly impossible to maintain under constant attack. What had once been a symbol of technological superiority now stood as proof that complexity without sustainability was fatal. Even Hitler himself, who had once boasted of the Tiger as a weapon of destiny, began to shift focus toward the defensive. Underground factories, anti-aircraft guns, and the new V-weapons absorbed resources once meant for tanks. But these were acts of desperation, not innovation. In Allied circles, the victory reshaped thinking just as profoundly. Air commanders like Karl Spaatz and Arthur Tedder championed the idea that control of the air was not merely support for ground forces. It was the decisive condition for victory. The Tiger's destruction became a case study in military academies long after the war, demonstrating that no armor, however strong, could survive in an enemy's sky. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they faced far fewer tanks. German armored formations existed mostly on paper. Many of the remaining Tigers were hidden in forests used as stationary bunkers, steel monuments to a strategy that no longer worked. For the men who once commanded them, the transformation was bitter. Their war had begun with thunderous advances across open plains. It ended with static defense hunted by unseen enemies above. The lesson was brutal but undeniable. The battlefield of the future would belong to those who ruled the air, not the ground. And in the charred ruins of the Tiger's empire, that future had already begun. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the fields of Europe were littered with reminders of both human brilliance and human blindness. Among them, few symbols stood taller and or rusted longer than the Tiger tank. It had begun as a vision of perfection. German engineers designed it to dominate, to strike fear, to embody the spirit of invincibility. And for a time it did. On the Eastern Front in Tunisia, and in the hedgerows of Normandy, it proved its power again and again. But war has a way of humbling its own creations. The Tiger's defeat was not simply mechanical, it was philosophical. It showed that no weapon, however mighty, can exist in isolation from the world around it. Technology thrives on connection: air, fuel, intelligence, communication. Once the skies turned hostile, even the most formidable tank became a coffin of steel. For the men inside those machines, this was not a lesson in theory. It was life and death. They fought not out of arrogance, but out of duty, courage, and faith in their weapon. Many died believing that if they had just one more chance, one more Tiger, they could turn the tide. But history had already moved past them. The war that ended in flames had begun with speed and surprise, blitzkrieg, shock, and steel. It ended in coordination, precision, and domination from above. In that transformation lies the story of modern warfare itself. The Tiger's fall was the moment the tank yielded to the aircraft, when the future of combat lifted from the ground and disappeared into the sky. Today the surviving Tigers rest in museums, silent, immense, and still commanding awe. But for those who understand what they represent, their silence speaks louder than their guns ever did. It says that power without adaptability is doomed, that pride without protection is fragile, and that in war, as in history, no empire and no machine is invincible forever.